You have been told to trust your intuition. What you have not been told is that the mind you are using to decide whether your intuition is trustworthy is the same mind that makes intuition impossible. Florence Scovel Shinn published her first book in New York in 1925, the same year the American Psychological Association was still debating whether the unconscious mind was a legitimate subject of scientific inquiry. She was not waiting for the debate to conclude. She had already run the experiment several hundred times, with clients, in real financial and personal crises, with documented outcomes. Her conclusion was not philosophical, it was operational. The analytical mind, when applied to a spiritual law, does not produce a weaker result. It produces the opposite result. By the end of this audiobook, you will understand precisely why the effort you have been applying to your practice is the variable responsible for its failure. Not the depth of your belief, not the quality of your intentions, the effort itself, the reasoning, the monitoring, the logical verification that what you are doing is working. That specific motion is what Shinn identified as the mechanism of blockage. She called it interference. Modern cognitive science has a different name for it. The name is less important than the recognition, and after this audiobook, you will recognize it every time it begins. This is not an argument against intelligence. Shinn was a precise thinker. Jung was a precise thinker. Precision is not the problem. The direction precision aimed at is the problem. That distinction will take 60 minutes to make correctly. It cannot be made faster without losing the part that changes anything. Chapter 1. The Competence Trap. Why trying harder is the mechanism of failure. There is a specific kind of failure that only happens to capable people, not the failure that comes from ignorance or laziness or insufficient effort. The failure that comes from applying a sophisticated, well-trained mind to a system that the sophisticated, well-trained mind was never designed to operate. This is what Florence Scovel Shinn was describing in 1925. Not a self-help program, not a collection of positive thinking techniques. A diagnosis, precise, uncomfortable, and aimed directly at the people most likely to resist it. The ones who are already trying hard. The diagnosis has one sentence at its center. Every mechanism in her system is a consequence of it. The sentence is this: the conscious reasoning mind, when directed at the process of manifestation, does not assist the process. It arrests it. Most people who encounter this idea absorb it incorrectly. They hear it as an argument for passivity. Stop thinking, stop planning, stop analyzing. Simply believe and wait. That is not what Shinn said. It is almost the precise opposite of what she said. The error in that reading is the word directed. The problem is not the thought itself. The problem is thought aimed inward, at the mechanism. Thought that monitors, evaluates, and attempts to verify whether the law is working. That specific motion is what stops it. The distinction matters because it changes what the practitioner actually has to do. Passivity is easy to understand and nearly impossible to sustain. What Shinn was actually prescribing was harder and more specific. Full external engagement combined with complete internal release. Act as if the outcome is already secured. Not because it feels secure, because the act of feeling insecure is itself the interference. Jung identified the same structure 40 years later from the clinical direction. He called it the ego's compulsion to manage outcomes, the rational self's inability to tolerate uncertainty without converting it into a problem to be solved. What he observed in his patients was a loop. Anxiety generates analysis. Analysis generates the illusion of control. The illusion of control temporarily reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety allows the original problem to persist, and persistence generates more anxiety. The loop is self-sealing. The ego cannot break it from inside the loop because the loop is made of ego. Shinn did not have Jung's vocabulary. She had something more useful for the people sitting across from her in financial crisis, in failed relationships, in health emergencies. She had a procedure. Stop reasoning toward the outcome, speak the outcome as already true, then move, physically, practically, specifically, as if no further intervention is required from you. The word speak is not rhetorical here, it is structural. She believed the spoken decree operated as a legal instrument, a formal claim entered into a system that processed it with mechanical consistency. The system did not evaluate the claim for plausibility. It did not weigh the speaker's history or current circumstances. It processed the claim as stated. What interrupted the processing was not doubt in the ordinary sense. It was the continued operation of the analytical mind on the same channel that the decree was using. Two signals on one frequency. The decree could not transmit through the interference. This is the point where most readers encounter the idea and believe they have understood it. They have understood the metaphor. They have not yet touched the mechanism. The mechanism requires a harder question. What does the analytical mind actually do when a person attempts to apply Shinn's system? It does not go quiet. It does not suspend operation out of deference to the decree. It begins immediately to evaluate the decree for consistency with current observable reality. It notes the gap between the spoken claim and the visible evidence. It generates what feels like a responsible, grounded awareness of the situation. It calls this awareness clarity. Shinn called it the opposite of clarity. She called it the substitution of appearances for reality, the error of treating the visible as more authoritative than the spoken. In her framework, the visible world was a delayed record of prior mental and verbal activity. It was already behind the decree by definition. Evaluating the decree against the visible evidence was, in her terms, precisely equivalent to a navigator checking yesterday's position to determine whether today's heading was correct. The heading was spoken this morning. Yesterday's position is irrelevant. The analytical mind does not accept this. It continues checking. The people who came to Shinn in 1925 New York were not, in the main, mystics or spiritual seekers. They were people in practical emergencies, rent due, businesses failing, relationships fractured, health deteriorating. They came because ordinary methods had not worked. What she gave them was not comfort. It was a reorientation so fundamental that most of them initially resisted it, because it required them to stop doing the one thing that felt like taking the situation seriously. Reasoning about it. She documented the cases. A woman facing eviction spoke a decree about her permanent home and received an unexpected inheritance within days, not weeks. A man whose business had failed for 3 consecutive years stopped analyzing what had gone wrong and spoke a decree about the natural success of his rightful work. The business recovered within a month. Shinn recorded these not as miracles but as demonstrations, evidence that the law operated consistently when the interference was removed. The skeptical reader will note that such cases are not controlled experiments. This is correct. Shinn was not running controlled experiments. She was running a practice, the same practice a physician runs when they observe that a treatment produces results consistently enough to be applied, regardless of whether the underlying mechanism has been formally proven. Her mechanism has since been partially mapped by cognitive science under different terminology. The mapping is incomplete. The results were not. What this means for the practitioner is not a single change in behavior. It is a single change in understanding that makes a different set of behaviors available. The behavior Shinn was pointing toward, decree, release, act, do not monitor, is not difficult to perform once the underlying logic is accepted. It is nearly impossible to perform while the analytical mind still believes that monitoring is protective. The protection is the problem. That sentence will require the rest of this audiobook to become fully operational. What the next chapter will establish is why the protection felt necessary in the first place, and when, historically and psychologically, the analytical mind acquired the authority it currently holds over decisions it was never designed to make. The authority was assigned, which means it can be reassigned. Chapter 2. 300 Years of Misdirection. How Western Reasoning Became the Default Spiritual Obstacle. The analytical mind did not always hold this authority. It was given to it, gradually, specifically, and for reasons that made complete sense at the time. Understanding when that transfer happened and why is not a historical detour. It is the only way to see the authority for what it is, a useful instrument that was promoted beyond its jurisdiction. The promotion happened in stages. The first stage was the scientific revolution of the 17th century, specifically the work of René Descartes, who in 1637 published the proposition that certainty could only be established through systematic doubt. Doubt everything that cannot be verified by reason. Accept only what reason confirms. This was not presented as a life philosophy. It was a methodology for mathematics and natural science. Within a century, it had become the operating assumption of educated Western culture, the invisible standard against which all knowledge claims were measured, including knowledge claims that had nothing to do with mathematics or natural science. By 1925, when Shinn was writing, the Cartesian inheritance was so thoroughly embedded in Western educated culture that it no longer announced itself. It simply felt like common sense. Of course you verify before you trust. Of course you reason before you act. Of course the evidence visible in front of you carries more authority than a spoken claim about an outcome that has not yet materialized. These felt like obvious truths. They were inherited assumptions, 300 years old, operating below the level of examination. Shinn was not anti-intellectual. She was archaeologically precise. She located the assumption, named it, and showed her clients what it was doing to their results. The New Thought movement, of which Shinn was the most practically rigorous practitioner, had been building this case since the 1880s. Phineas Quimby, the main clockmaker and mental healer, who is generally considered the movement's origin point, had observed in the 1850s that patients who recovered from illness consistently shared one characteristic. At some point in their treatment, they stopped reasoning about their condition and accepted a different account of it as true. The reasoning had not healed them. The cessation of reasoning about the illness, combined with the adoption of a counterclaim, had. Quimby's observations were clinical before they were philosophical. He documented hundreds of cases. He was not interested in why this worked. He was interested in the fact that it worked with sufficient consistency to be reproduced. His student Mary Baker Eddy took the observations in a theological direction. Shinn took them in a practical one. She stripped the system of its theological architecture, retaining the spiritual framework, but removing the doctrinal requirements, and handed it to people who needed results this week, not a new religious identity. What she retained from Quimby was the operational core. The spoken claim functions differently from the thought. A thought can be held and simultaneously doubted. A spoken decree, made with specificity and released without monitoring, enters a different processing channel. The analytical mind can observe a thought from the outside. It cannot occupy the same space as a fully committed spoken claim without the claim losing its charge. This distinction between thought and spoken word is not mystical. It is structural. William James, Harvard psychologist, philosopher, and the closest thing American intellectual life produced to a bridge between empirical science and the inner life, published his Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902, 23 years before Shinn's first book. James argued that religious and mystical experiences, whatever their ultimate metaphysical status, produced real and measurable changes in the people who had them. He did not argue for their literal truth. He argued for their functional reality. The experience was real. The change in the person was real. The mechanism behind both deserved serious investigation rather than dismissal. Shinn read James. The influence is visible in her refusal to argue for the metaphysical basis of her system. She never asked her clients to adopt a theology. She asked them to try the procedure and observe the results. This is precisely the methodology James had proposed for the investigation of inner experience. Treat it empirically. Apply it. Record what happens. What James supplied that Quimby lacked was intellectual legitimacy, the permission from inside the academy to take inner experience seriously as data. Shinn used that permission without ever citing it. By the time she was writing, the permission had become the air her work breathed. Jung enters this lineage not as a parallel development, but as a convergent one. Working in Zurich from the 1910s onward, Jung was documenting from the clinical direction what Shinn was documenting from the practical one, that the conscious, rational mind is a partial instrument. It is exquisitely well designed for navigating external, material reality. It is structurally incapable of accessing the deeper layers of the psyche where, in Jung's framework, the real determinants of a person's life were being set. Jung called the deeper layer the unconscious. Shinn called it the superconscious, or simply the divine. The vocabulary was different. The functional description was nearly identical, a layer of processing that operates below conscious awareness, that is not accessible to analytical reason, and that produces results in the material world that the conscious mind then experiences as either fortune or misfortune, depending entirely on what had been seeded there. The critical difference between Jung and Shinn was not philosophical, it was directional. Jung believed the unconscious could be explored, mapped, and gradually integrated through years of analytical work. Shinn believed it could be addressed directly, immediately, through the spoken word, bypassing the analytical layer entirely. Jung was building a longer road to the same destination. Shinn was handing people a door. Whether the door was real is a question this audiobook will not settle. What the historical record settles is this: the people who used it reported consistent results. Shinn documented them. Quimby documented them before her. James provided the intellectual framework for taking them seriously. Jung, working independently, described the mechanism that would explain them, and stopped just short of the operational conclusion Shinn had already reached. The lineage is not a collection of compatible ideas, it is a single argument, made by 4 people across 100 years, arriving at the same place from different directions. The place they arrived at is where this audiobook lives. What the next chapter will establish is the mechanism itself, not the historical argument for why it should exist, but the functional description of how it operates, what it requires from the practitioner, and why the version of it that most people apply is a partial version that produces partial results. The partiality is not an accident. It is the analytical mind's final intervention, the one it makes inside the practice itself. Chapter 3. The Decree, the Action, and the Silence. How the system actually operates. Every system has a failure mode built into its instructions. Shinn's failure mode is not located in the decree itself, or in the quality of the practitioner's belief, or in the specificity of what is being claimed. It is located in the moment immediately after the decree is spoken, the 3 to 5 seconds in which the analytical mind reasserts itself and begins to evaluate what just happened. That moment is where most applications of this system end. Not dramatically, not with a conscious decision to abandon the practice, with a single quiet question. Did that work? The question feels reasonable. It feels like responsible self-awareness. It is the precise motion that cancels the operation, because the operation requires the absence of monitoring, and monitoring is what the question initiates. Understanding why requires understanding what the decree actually does at the functional level, not metaphysically, but mechanically, in terms of what changes in the practitioner's cognitive and behavioral system the moment the spoken claim is fully committed. The spoken decree in Shinn's system performs three simultaneous functions. The first is declarative. It states an outcome as already true, in the present tense, without qualification. The second is directive. It redirects the practitioner's attention away from the problem and toward the condition being claimed. The third, and most consequential, is preemptive. It occupies the channel through which the analytical mind would otherwise continue generating counterclaims. The third function is why the voice matters. A thought can be held alongside its negation. The mind is capable of believing and doubting simultaneously. In fact, this is its default state when confronting uncertainty. The spoken word, committed fully and released, does not permit simultaneous negation in the same way. The mouth can only say one thing at a time. The act of saying the claim completely, without hedging, without the softening qualifiers the analytical mind would insert, temporarily displaces the counter-narrative. Temporarily is the operative word. The displacement lasts precisely as long as the practitioner does not re-engage the monitoring function. The moment monitoring begins, the moment the question, "Did that work?" is asked, or the moment the practitioner begins scanning visible reality for evidence of the decree's operation, the counter-narrative returns. It returns with additional force because it now has new evidence. Nothing has visibly changed yet. Nothing was supposed to have changed yet. The visible world in Shinn's framework is a trailing indicator. It records what has already been seeded, not what is currently being seeded. Checking it for confirmation of the decree is equivalent to looking at last month's weather to predict tomorrow's. The data is real. It is simply not the relevant data. The practitioners who got consistent results from Shinn's system shared one behavioral characteristic that she documented repeatedly. They moved. After the decree, they did not sit and wait for visible evidence. They took the next available practical action in the direction of the claimed outcome, not as a strategy for producing it, but as a physical enactment of the belief that it was already secured. She called this preparing the channel. A woman claiming a new home began looking at furniture, not because she could afford furniture yet, because the act of looking at furniture was the behavior of a person who already had the home, and performing that behavior reinforced the decree at the level of physical action rather than leaving it as a spoken abstraction. This is the element of Shinn's system most consistently omitted in popular retellings. The law of attraction, as it entered mainstream culture through the early 21st century, emphasized the inner state, visualization, feeling, vibrational alignment. Shinn emphasized the outer action, not as the cause of the result, but as the physical language of the decree. The action said, in the domain of behavior, what the decree had said in the domain of speech. The two aligned. The analytical mind, which monitors behavior as well as thought, received a consistent signal from both channels. Its counter-narrative found less purchase. The inner state alone was insufficient. The action alone was insufficient. The alignment of the two, spoken decree and congruent behavior, neither one monitoring the other, was the mechanism. There is a specific failure mode Shinn documented more than any other. She called it the temptation of appearances. It operates as follows. The practitioner speaks the decree, takes the congruent action, and then encounters a visible development that seems to contradict the claimed outcome. A door closes. A relationship deteriorates. A financial situation worsens before it improves. The analytical mind, which has been monitoring throughout, immediately processes this development as evidence that the decree failed. It is not evidence that the decree failed. In Shinn's documented cases, it was consistently evidence that the decree was working, that the system was in the process of clearing the conditions that had produced the original problem, before delivering the claimed outcome. She described this as the period of testing, and she was explicit. The practitioners who abandoned the decree during this period, on the basis of visible contrary evidence, reset the process to zero. The ones who held the decree, not through gritted teeth willpower, but through the genuine understanding that visible contrary evidence was a trailing indicator, not a current signal, moved through it. The distinction between willpower and understanding is not semantic. Willpower operates in the domain of the analytical mind. It is effortful, depleting, and finite. Understanding operates in a different domain, the domain where the decree was spoken in the first place. A practitioner who genuinely understands that the visible world is a delayed record does not need willpower to hold the decree against contrary appearances. They simply know that the appearances are behind the decree, the way a traveler knows that the city they are driving toward has not ceased to exist because they cannot yet see it. The city is there. The road is the process. Stopping to verify that the city still exists does not accelerate the arrival. It is the one action guaranteed to extend the journey. The mechanism, stated plainly, is this: speak the outcome as already secured, act as if it is already secured, and remove the monitoring function entirely. Not because monitoring is intellectually weak, but because monitoring is structurally incompatible with the operation being performed. A surgeon scrubs in. A surgeon does not simultaneously evaluate whether hand-washing is a valid medical practice. The evaluation happened before the operating room. Inside the operating room, only the procedure exists. Shinn's practitioners were being asked to enter the operating room. Most of them kept one hand on the door. What the next chapter will establish is the claim this audiobook has been building toward. The counterintuitive turn that reframes everything that has come before it, and that most people who study Shinn's work never reach because they stop here, satisfied that they have understood the mechanism. They have understood the description of the mechanism. The mechanism itself is one layer deeper, and that layer changes the entire practice. Chapter 4. You are speaking from the wrong address. Everything covered in the first 3 chapters is correct. It is also, in a precise and consequential sense, incomplete, and the incompleteness is not an oversight. It is the place where Shinn's system separates from every adjacent system that superficially resembles it, and where the practitioners who get consistent results diverge permanently from the practitioners who get intermittent ones. The incomplete version of the system says, stop reasoning, speak the decree, act congruently, release the monitoring function. This is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not address is the question underneath the question, the one that precedes the decree, precedes the action, precedes the monitoring, and determines whether any of those operations are being performed from the right layer of the self. The question is this: who is speaking? Shinn made a distinction that her popular interpreters have almost universally collapsed. She distinguished between the outer self, what she called the human mind, the analytical faculty, the ego in its ordinary functional sense, and what she called the divine self, the superconscious, the layer of the person that exists prior to the personality and its accumulated history of failure, doubt, and defensive reasoning. The decree in her system is not spoken by the outer self on behalf of the divine self. It is spoken as the divine self, from that layer, not toward it. This is not a spiritual technicality. It is the operational core of the entire system, and it is the element that makes the difference between a decree that transmits and one that performs the surface motions of transmission while remaining functionally a request from a frightened person to an authority they are not sure exists. A request carries the frequency of its sender. A declaration carries the frequency of its source. Shinn's practitioners who produced documented results were not requesting outcomes. They were declaring them, from a position of identity with the authority that could secure them. The outer self was not the agent. The outer self was the instrument through which the declaration was made. This is where the comparison with Jung becomes structurally precise rather than merely illustrative. Jung's entire therapeutic project was the gradual integration of the unconscious into conscious awareness. The long, difficult process of bringing the deeper layers of the self into relationship with the ego. He assumed, based on decades of clinical observation, that this integration required time, analysis, and a skilled interpreter. The unconscious did not yield its contents quickly or willingly. It communicated in symbols, in dreams, in symptoms. It had to be decoded. Shinn's position was categorically different, and it is worth stating it without softening. She believed Jung was describing a real phenomenon and proposing the wrong procedure for it. Not wrong in the sense of harmful, wrong in the sense of unnecessarily indirect. The deeper self did not need to be decoded. It needed to be inhabited, not approached, not analyzed, not gradually integrated. Stepped into, immediately, through the act of speaking from it rather than toward it. The difference between approaching the divine self and speaking as the divine self is the difference between a person standing outside a building, studying its architecture, and a person inside the building, operating its systems. Jung was producing extraordinarily precise blueprints. Shinn was handing people the key. The key was the identity claim embedded in the decree, not the words of the decree, but the position from which the words were spoken. This reframes the failure mode identified in Chapter 3. The monitoring function, the question, "Did that work?" spoken immediately after the decree, is not simply an analytical habit. It is identity evidence. It reveals that the decree was spoken by the outer self, monitoring on behalf of the outer self, hoping the system would respond to a request it dressed in the language of a declaration. The system does not process requests, it processes declarations. The difference is not tonal, it is structural. A request contains within it the acknowledgement that the outcome is not yet secured and may not be secured. A declaration contains within it the acknowledgement that the outcome is already secured at the level from which the declaration originates, and that the visible world will catch up, because the visible world always catches up. The outer self cannot make a declaration. It can only make requests that sound like declarations. The practitioner who has spent months applying Shinn's system without consistent results is, in almost every case, a person whose outer self has become very skilled at performing the surface language of declaration, while the underlying frequency remains a request. Shinn documented this pattern with clinical precision. She called it praying amiss, asking for outcomes from a position of separation from the source that secured them, rather than declaring outcomes from a position of identity with that source. The prayer was correct in its words. It was spoken from the wrong address. What changes when the practitioner speaks as the divine self rather than toward it is not the content of the decree. It is the quality of the silence that follows it. The outer self, after a request, monitors. It watches for confirmation. It scans for evidence. It cannot do otherwise. The request was made from a position of uncertainty, and uncertainty generates monitoring as automatically as a wound generates inflammation. The divine self, after a declaration, does not monitor. There is nothing to monitor. The outcome is already secured at the level of its origin. What remains is simply the interval between the declaration and its visible manifestation. An interval the practitioner moves through with congruent action, not because the action produces the result, but because the action is what a person who has already received the result does while waiting for the paperwork to arrive. This is what Shinn meant by faith, not the effortful suspension of doubt, not the willful maintenance of positive expectation against contrary evidence. The settled quality of a person who has already received a confirmation that the visible world has not yet caught up to. Faith, in her system, is not an emotional state, it is an informational state. The information is, the declaration has been made from the correct address, and the system has already processed it. The outer self experiences this as certainty. The analytical mind experiences it as irrationality. Both descriptions are accurate. The question is, which layer of the self is being consulted for the verdict? Everything that follows in this audiobook is an elaboration of this single recognition. The application, the failure modes, the comparison with Jung, all of it is downstream of the identity question, not who is asking, who is speaking. That question does not resolve intellectually, it resolves experientially, in the moment of the decree. When the practitioner either steps into the correct address or performs the motion from outside it. The next chapter will show exactly what that looks like in practice and precisely where the outer self inserts itself into the process in ways so subtle that most practitioners never identify the insertion point. Chapter 5. Where the system breaks. The 3 insertion points nobody talks about. The insertion point is not where most practitioners look for it. They look at the decree itself, its wording, its specificity, its emotional tone. They revise the language, they adjust the timing, they experiment with delivery. None of this addresses the actual problem, because the actual problem is not in the decree. It is in the 3 decisions the practitioner makes before the decree is spoken, and the 1 decision they make in the 10 seconds after it. Shinn documented the insertion points across hundreds of cases. They are consistent enough to be mapped. What follows is not a list of spiritual principles. It is a diagnostic, the specific locations where the outer self re-enters a process it was excluded from, and the behavioral signatures that mark each location. The first insertion point is the selection of the decree itself. The outer self, when asked to formulate a decree, will consistently produce language that is acceptable to it, which means language that does not fully commit. Language that leaves a perceptible exit in case the outcome does not materialize. Language that sounds like declaration, but carries the grammatical structure of a negotiation. The signature is conditional phrasing. I am grateful that my right work is finding me now is a declaration. I am open to receiving my right work is a request wearing a declaration's clothing. The word open contains within it the acknowledgement that the outcome has not arrived and may not arrive. The practitioner is merely indicating willingness. Shinn was not describing willingness, she was describing arrival. The outer self prefers the conditional form because the conditional form cannot be falsified. If the outcome does not materialize, the practitioner was open to it, but it did not come, a position that preserves the outer self's authority and protects it from the discomfort of having made a claim that was not honored. The divine self does not require this protection. It does not formulate exit strategies. It states the outcome and moves. Practitioners who find themselves consistently revising their decree language, softening it, qualifying it, replacing declarative verbs with receptive ones, are watching the first insertion point operate in real time. The second insertion point is timing. The outer self has a strong preference for speaking decrees when visible circumstances are not actively contradicting them. When the financial situation is stable, it can decree abundance. When the relationship is calm, it can decree harmony. When the health report is neutral, it can decree well-being. What it resists, strenuously and with sophisticated justification, is speaking the decree at the precise moment when visible circumstances most loudly contradict it. This is exactly backwards from Shinn's instruction. She was explicit. The decree is most necessary and most powerful at the moment of maximum visible contradiction, because that is the moment when the gap between the visible trailing record and the spoken declaration is largest, which means the correction the system is being asked to perform is most significant, which means the practitioner's willingness to speak from the correct address under pressure is most clearly demonstrated. She documented a case that illustrates this with precision. A woman came to Shinn in acute financial crisis, a specific debt due within 48 hours, no visible means of resolution. Shinn gave her a decree about the immediate supply of everything she required. The woman's outer self resisted the decree on the grounds that the situation was too serious for affirmations. This is the outer self's most effective argument. The situation is too serious for this. The situations that feel too serious are the situations the decree was designed for. The woman spoke the decree. The money arrived within the 48-hour window through a channel she had not anticipated and could not have engineered through reasoning. Shinn recorded the case not as a miracle, but as a demonstration of the law operating at the point of maximum pressure, which is, consistently, where it produces its most visible results. The third insertion point is the most subtle and the most consequential. It occurs in the formulation of what is being claimed. The outer self, when left to select the decree's content, will claim the outcome it has already decided is possible, the slightly better version of the current situation, the modest improvement, the reasonable upgrade. It will not claim the divine design, which is Shinn's term for the outcome that the deeper self knows to be the correct one, regardless of whether the outer self has categorized it as achievable. The distinction between what the outer self considers possible and what the divine design actually is can be substantial. Shinn's clients who received the most significant results were consistently the ones who released their own assessment of what was achievable and spoke instead toward the outcome that felt, at the level of deep intuition rather than analytical evaluation, most fully correct, regardless of its apparent distance from current visible reality. This is where the intuition of the title becomes operationally precise. Intuition in Shinn's system is not a feeling. It is not a hunch or a preference or an emotional inclination. It is the divine self's direct communication of the correct claim. The outcome that the deeper layer of the self already knows is the rightful one. The analytical mind evaluates this communication for plausibility and frequently overrides it on the grounds that the claim is too large, too specific, or too far from current circumstances to be reasonable. Every override is a demotion. The practitioner substitutes a smaller, more defensible claim for the correct one, speaks it from the outer self's address, monitors its progress, and wonders why the results are partial. The results are partial because the claim was partial. The claim was partial because the analytical mind edited the intuition before the decree was spoken. The editing happened so quickly and felt so much like responsible calibration that the practitioner did not register it as an insertion. The diagnostic question Shinn implicitly posed to every client was simple enough to state and difficult enough to answer honestly. Is this decree what you know to be true from your deepest layer, or is it what your analytical mind has decided is safe enough to claim? The two feel similar from the outside. From the inside, they are distinguishable by a single quality. The decree that originates from the divine self carries no anxiety about whether it will be honored. Not because the practitioner has suppressed the anxiety, because at the level from which the decree originates, the outcome is not in question. The decree that originates from the outer self carries anxiety, regardless of how confidently it is spoken. Confidence is a performance. The anxiety is the signal. Most practitioners, asked to distinguish between these two states, report that they cannot. This is the confession of complexity that Shinn's system requires and rarely receives. The work of learning to speak from the correct address is not intellectual work. It cannot be accomplished by reading more carefully or thinking more precisely. It is accomplished by noticing, repeatedly and without judgment, the quality of the silence after the decree, and recognizing, in that silence, whether what just spoke was the outer self dressed in declaration language, or the deeper self making a claim it already knows is honored. The next chapter will show what Shinn understood about this process that Jung, for all the precision of his mapping, could not reach from the clinical direction, and why the gap between their two systems is not a disagreement about the nature of the deeper self, but a disagreement about whether the deeper self can be addressed directly, immediately, without the mediation of analysis. Shinn's answer was yes. Her case files were the argument. Chapter 6. Jung drew the map. Shinn handed you the key. Jung spent 50 years mapping the unconscious. He produced the most detailed cartography of the inner life that Western psychology has ever assembled. The shadow, the anima, the animus, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the individuation process. The map is extraordinary. It is also, by Jung's own late admission, a map of a territory he could describe with precision, but never fully enter on behalf of his patients. This is not a criticism of Jung. It is a structural observation about the method he was using. Clinical analysis operates through language, interpretation, and the gradual construction of meaning over time. It assumes that the deeper self yields its content slowly, that integration requires extended engagement, and that the analyst's role is to facilitate a process the patient cannot perform alone. These assumptions produced extraordinary results in the consulting room. They also built into the method a ceiling, the ceiling imposed by the assumption that the deeper self requires mediation before it can be addressed. Shinn did not share this assumption, and the difference between her system and Jung's is not philosophical disagreement. It is a disagreement about access, about whether the deeper self is a territory that must be approached carefully through the front gate of analysis, or a layer of the self that is available immediately, directly, to anyone willing to speak from it rather than toward it. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious is the place where the comparison becomes most instructive. He proposed, based on the cross-cultural consistency of archetypal imagery appearing in his patients' dreams and associations, that beneath the personal unconscious lay a deeper layer shared by all human beings, a substrate of universal patterns that the individual psyche drew from without being aware of it. This layer was not created by personal experience. It preceded personal experience. It was, in Jung's framework, the inherited psychological architecture of the species. Shinn called this layer the superconscious. She did not arrive at it through clinical observation of dream imagery. She arrived at it through the observation that certain practitioners, when they spoke their decrees from a sufficiently deep layer of themselves, produced results that bore no relationship to their personal history, their visible resources, or the logical chain of causation that the analytical mind would construct between current circumstances and desired outcome. The result arrived through channels that personal effort could not have engineered, which meant, in her framework, that a layer beyond personal history had been engaged. Jung described this layer. Shinn engaged it. The distinction is not a matter of depth or sophistication. It is a matter of method, and method determines what is available to the practitioner. The specific point at which Jung's method reaches its ceiling is the point Shinn's method begins. Jung believed the ego, the conscious analytical self, needed to be strengthened before it could enter into productive relationship with the deeper layers of the psyche. A fragile ego, confronted with the contents of the unconscious without adequate preparation, risked being overwhelmed by them. The analytical process was, in part, a process of building sufficient ego strength to tolerate the encounter with the deeper self without dissolution. Shinn's framework inverted this entirely. The ego in her system is not strengthened in preparation for contact with the deeper self. It is set aside, not dissolved, not destroyed, but temporarily suspended from its role as the primary decision-making authority. The practitioner does not approach the deeper self as a stronger, more integrated ego. The practitioner steps out of the ego's address entirely and speaks from the layer that precedes it. This is not a process Jung could recommend clinically, because the clinical context assumes that the ego is the instrument through which therapeutic work is performed. Remove the ego from the process, and the clinical method has no operator. Shinn was not performing a clinical method. She was performing a direct address. And direct address requires not a stronger ego, but a temporarily suspended one. The suspension is not permanent, and it is not pathological. It is the specific, bounded act of speaking a decree from the correct layer and then returning to ordinary functioning. The ego resumes its role immediately afterward. What changes is not the ego's strength or structure. What changes is its understanding of its own jurisdiction. There is a moment in Jung's late work, specifically in his 1952 essay on synchronicity, where he came closer to Shinn's territory than at any other point in his published writing. Synchronicity, as Jung defined it, was the meaningful coincidence of an inner state and an outer event, a connection that could not be explained by linear causation, but that occurred with sufficient frequency and specificity to require a framework beyond ordinary cause and effect. He documented hundreds of cases. He proposed a theoretical framework. He stopped precisely at the threshold of the operational conclusion, the conclusion that if the inner state and the outer event are connected in a way that transcends linear causation, then the deliberate cultivation of specific inner states should produce specific outer events with a consistency that the causal framework cannot account for, but the synchronistic one can. Shinn had already drawn this conclusion in 1925 and built a practice around it. Jung documented the phenomenon from the outside. Shinn was operating it from the inside. He was the more rigorous theorist. She was the more useful practitioner. Both descriptions are accurate, and neither diminishes the other. But for the person sitting across from a specific problem that requires a specific result, the distinction between theorist and practitioner is not academic. What Shinn understood that Jung could not reach from his direction is this: the deeper self does not require interpretation. It requires address. The difference between these two operations is the difference between studying a musical instrument and playing it. Jung produced the most detailed study of the instrument that Western psychology has assembled. Shinn played it, imperfectly, empirically, with documented results, and handed the method to people who needed music, not musicology. The analytical mind, confronted with this comparison, will immediately generate a qualification. But surely the study of the instrument improves the playing. This is correct. Jung's maps are genuinely useful to anyone serious about Shinn's practice, not as a substitute for the practice, but as a framework for understanding what the practice is engaging. The map does not replace the territory. It makes the territory navigable. The territory itself is available without the map. Shinn's clients, most of whom had never read Jung, and several of whom had never read Shinn before walking into her office, accessed it through a single operation, speaking a specific claim from the correct address without monitoring its progress. The map describes that operation in several 100,000 words across 40 volumes. The operation itself takes 30 seconds. What the final chapter will establish is not a summary of what has been covered. It is a reframe of the entire subject, a connection between Shinn's system and a framework that did not exist in her lifetime, that she could not have anticipated, and that maps the mechanism she was operating, with a precision that makes the operation both more explicable and, paradoxically, more demanding. More demanding because once the mechanism is fully visible, the one remaining obstacle becomes equally visible, and the one remaining. Chapter 7. The filter that was never closed. The reticular activating system is a network of neurons at the base of the brainstem, approximately the size of a little finger, that functions as the brain's primary filter for incoming information. The human sensory system receives an estimated 11 million bits of information per second. The conscious mind processes approximately 40. The reticular activating system selects the 40. The selection criteria are not random. The reticular activating system filters for what the brain has been primed to consider relevant, which means it filters for what the person has already decided, consciously or otherwise, is worth attending to. A person who has recently purchased a red car begins noticing red cars everywhere. The red cars were always there. The filter had not previously flagged them as relevant. The moment the person acquired a red car, the filter updated its criteria and the red cars became visible. This is not a metaphor for Shinn's system. It is the system, described in the language of contemporary neuroscience, operating through the same mechanism Shinn was engaging in 1925, producing the same category of results through the same functional operation. The spoken decree, committed fully and released without monitoring, does not change external reality directly. It updates the filter. And a filter that has been updated to register the claimed outcome as relevant begins locating, in the existing environment, the pathways, people, and circumstances that were already present but previously invisible. The channel was never closed, it was unfiltered. This reframe does not diminish Shinn's system, it makes it more precise and more demanding. Because if the mechanism is the filter, then the question of who is speaking, which Chapter 4 identified as the operational core of the entire practice, becomes a question about filter depth. The outer self updates the filter at the surface level, the level of conscious attention, deliberate focus, chosen emphasis. This produces results. They are the partial results that most practitioners of the law of attraction recognize: increased awareness of relevant opportunities, heightened sensitivity to synchronistic connections, a general improvement in the quality of what is noticed. The divine self, in Shinn's framework, updates the filter at a deeper level, below conscious attention, below deliberate focus, at the layer where the criteria for relevance are set before conscious attention begins its work. This is the layer the reticular activating system actually operates from. It does not take instructions from the conscious mind directly. It takes instructions from the deeper structures of belief, identity, and expectation that the conscious mind sits on top of, the structures that were largely formed before the age of 7 and that the analytical mind has been working with, not below, ever since. The decree that produced the extraordinary results Shinn documented was not update the conscious filter. It was updating the structural filter, the one that operates prior to consciousness, that sets the terms on which reality is passed, that determines not what the person notices, but what the person is capable of noticing. That filter does not respond to requests. It responds to declarations made from the layer of the self that shares its operational depth. This is why the identity question is not philosophical, it is neurological. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher who in 1907 proposed that the brain functions not as a generator of consciousness, but as a filter of it, reducing an essentially unlimited field of awareness to the narrow band required for biological survival, was working on the same problem from a philosophical direction. His filter thesis proposed that what we experience as ordinary reality is a radical reduction of what is actually available to perception, performed by the nervous system in the service of practical action. Shinn read Bergson. The influence is not documented in her published work, but the structural parallel is too precise to be coincidental. If the brain is a filter rather than a generator, if ordinary perception is a reduction rather than a complete picture, then the question of what lies beyond the filter's current settings is not a mystical question. It is a practical one. And the question of how to update the filter's settings is not a question about faith or spirituality. It is a question about the mechanism. Shinn's answer to the mechanism question was the spoken decree made from the correct address. Bergson's filter thesis explains why the address matters. A declaration made from the outer self updates the filter at the conscious level. A declaration made from the deeper self, from the layer that precedes the ego's formation, and operates at the structural depth, where the filter's criteria are set, updates the filter at the level where the criteria originate. The intellect is not the enemy of faith because it doubts. It is the enemy of faith because it calculates, and calculation is the one motion that closes the channel completely. That sentence requires one final elaboration. Calculation in this context is not mathematics or logical reasoning in the abstract. It is the specific operation of evaluating whether the declared outcome is achievable, given current visible resources, current visible circumstances, and the linear chain of causation that connects present conditions to future results. Calculation operates entirely within the existing filter settings. It can only assess what the current filter makes visible. It cannot access the pathways the updated filter would reveal, because those pathways are, by definition, currently invisible. This is the closed loop the analytical mind cannot exit from inside itself. It calculates based on what it can see. What it can see is determined by the filter. The filter cannot be updated by calculation because calculation requires the filter to already be set to its current parameters. The exit from the loop is not a better calculation. It is a declaration made from below the level where calculation operates, a direct instruction to the filter from the layer of the self that has the authority to change its criteria. Shinn called this authority the divine self. Bergson called the territory it accessed the fuller reality beyond the biological filter. The reticular activating system is the anatomical address where the instruction is received and executed. 3 frameworks, 3 vocabularies, 1 mechanism. What Shinn built in 1925, without the neuroscience, without Bergson's full philosophical apparatus, and without Jung's clinical maps, was a procedure for updating the structural filter directly, bypassing the analytical layer that can only work within the filter's existing settings, addressing the deeper layer that sets the criteria, and then moving through the interval between the declaration and its visible manifestation with the behavior of a person whose filter has already been updated. The behavior is the confirmation, not the confirmation that the result is coming, but the confirmation that the declaration was made from the correct address. A person whose filter has genuinely been updated does not monitor for results. They move toward them, the way a person moves toward a city they know exists, on a road they know leads there, without stopping to verify that the city has not disappeared since they last checked. The city does not disappear. The filter does not revert, once genuinely updated, to its prior settings. What reverts is the practitioner who made the declaration from the outer self's address and is now discovering, in the absence of visible confirmation, that the outer self never actually released the monitoring function. It merely suspended it temporarily, waiting for evidence, and is now, in the absence of evidence, resuming control. The resumption feels like realism. It is the filter protecting its current settings. Florence Scovel Shinn died in 1940. Her books have never gone out of print. The system she described has been repackaged under dozens of names across 100 years. The law of attraction, manifestation, intentional living, neuroplasticity-based goal setting, reticular activation theory. Each repackaging captures a layer of the mechanism and misses the one beneath it. The layer that keeps getting missed is the identity layer. Not what is being claimed, not how confidently it is spoken, not how specifically it is visualized, or how consistently it is affirmed. Who is speaking, and from what address, at what structural depth, with what quality of settled authority in the silence that follows? That question was not invented by Shinn. It predates her by several millennia, in traditions that describe the same mechanism in the vocabulary of their own frameworks: prayer, decree, invocation, intention. What Shinn did was strip the mechanism of its doctrinal requirements, document its results empirically, and hand it to people in practical emergencies who did not have the luxury of philosophical deliberation. The mechanism has not changed. The emergencies have not changed. The one thing that changes, in every generation and every repackaging, is the vocabulary available for describing what is already operating. The vocabulary in this audiobook will be superseded. The operation it describes will not.